The next section of the final exam review is on Chapter 9, Energy Balance and Obesity. Let's start with the percent of Americans that are considered either overweight or obese. We can see here in green, this is the healthy weight, whereas our overweight is about 27%, obese being 35%. You can see the extreme obesity is shown here in purple with underweight here. And if we put all that together, the overweight, obese, and extreme obesity, you can see we're approaching 70%. Now, why does it matter? Why does it matter if someone is overweight or obese? Well, the problem is that obesity is associated with a number of chronic diseases, including dyslipidemia, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, stroke, heart disease, gallbladder disease, osteoarthritis, sleep apnea, and respiratory problems. Now, how do we measure obesity? Well, we measure this using the body mass index. And the body mass index is basically a way of measuring obesity based on height and weight. Now, we learned that there are some problems with just using BMI, body mass index, BMI, as a measure of obesity, because Michael Jordan is considered overweight based on the body mass index. He's 6'6", 216, that would be considered overweight. And I want to say he is. This was obviously when he was playing basketball. So the other ways that we actually look at determining health based on weight, one, we have the BMI, but two is our waist circumference. Next is the disease profile, and then physical activity. So looking at all of these factors will help determine somebody's health. Now, those based on, I should say, either weight, height, or adiposity are going to be BMI and waist circumference. It's important to know that the waist circumference is, once it goes up, that means that when it's over 40 inches for men or over 35 for women, that is extremely unhealthy. And this is a representation of visceral fat. So that's the abdominal fat. Remember, there are different places that we store fat. There's subcutaneous fat, which, that's the fat that's just right under your skin layer that helps keep you warm. Women in their childbearing years in particular will store weight mostly on the thighs and the buttocks area. But the visceral fat is that abdominal fat, the fat that occurs around the bellies. But it's also in around the organs. It's a very mobile type of fat, so it's constantly being like a checking account, fat going in, fat going out, so it's circulating through the bloodstream. So this type of fat, the visceral fat, is associated with a higher risk of disease. And what diseases? The same one we talked about before, but hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, metabolic syndrome. So all of those chronic diseases, in particular those I just named, are associated with visceral fat or abdominal obesity. Now, of course, by now you know what a calorie is, but to remind you, it is a unit of food energy. Now remember, we don't eat calories, we eat food. Our body takes in that food. It breaks it down, it digests it. It absorbs those individual nutrients, and then it takes those nutrients, and in particular with carbohydrate and fat, it will break that down, and that generates energy. And that energy is then used to do everything that we need to do. So a calorie is a unit of energy. And we eat food, we don't eat calories, we eat food, but we measure the energy that's produced from that food as a calorie. Now, I do want to kind of emphasize, and I talked about this before, I won't go into too much detail, but a calorie is not a calorie is not a calorie. And you may have heard it before coming to this class that a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. It doesn't matter, but it really does matter. And what I want you to think about is, when you're finishing up with this class, is you're eating a food that those energy-yielding nutrients can break down to give energy. But whatever comes with them, whether it's a whole food and it comes with phytonutrients and fiber, or if it comes with a bunch of food additives, that is going to determine what really happens to that calorie, whether it's going to get stored as fat. It's going to change the hormonal balances in our body. And then also, remember we talked about carbohydrates and fats being fairly simple compared to proteins. Well, it takes energy to break down a protein. It's not an efficient source of energy, so you're not really going to get those 4 calories out. And then we don't even want to use protein for energy. So a calorie really isn't just a calorie. And I know it is a unit of measure, and when you measure it, it is going to be that calorie, but when you think of a food, I want you to think about it differently. I want you to think about what's coming with that food and how that helps determine what happens to that energy and where it goes. Now, when we think of that calorie in, calorie out theory, the calorie in is through food and beverages. The calories out is through the thermic effect of food, so that's the energy we need to actually eat our food and digest. It takes more for protein than it does, say, for a bagel. The basal metabolic rate, BMR, that is your basic low-level metabolism to do everything you do. You want to breathe, you'd like your heart to beat, you've got to make your enzymes and your proteins, your skin layer is constantly being built up and it sheds. So your body is constantly doing these things, making antibodies, it's driving your immune system. So these are kind of your basal metabolic processes that need to be run through calories. And that's basically your biggest chunk of calories right there. And then physical activity. Now for someone who's really active, that's going to be their biggest chunk of calories out. But for the most part, it's usually the basal metabolic rate. And this is everything I just went through. So for the BMR, we look at a few things. And this is going to change. So as people get older, the basal metabolic rate goes down. People who are taller have a greater metabolic rate. They have more surface area. They have more surface area to keep warm. Growth. Kids definitely have a greater metabolic rate. Think about how much energy it would take to not only just maintain your bones, to get those bones to grow long, the skin around you has to grow, the muscles have to grow, everything has to grow in size. So just to keep that at a basic rate. So children definitely have a higher basal metabolic rate. Oh, and also in pregnancy as well. Body composition. It takes a lot more energy just to have muscle, to sit with if you had a lot of muscle than to sit if you had a lot of fat. So muscle is very metabolically active, and it takes energy, even if you're not using your muscles. But for fat, not so much. So body composition is going to, if you have more muscle and less fat, will increase your basal metabolic rate. If you're sick, injured, just had surgery, your body definitely goes into overdrive, increases pretty much everything. Stress increases basal metabolic rate. Decreased temperature will increase basal metabolic rate. Starvation, so not just a period of fasting, but long-term starvation definitely will decrease the metabolic rate. That means that everything kind of slows down because you don't have as many nutrients, so your body decides what it's going to do. Am I going to use this precious energy to do X, or am I going to do Y? And I'll have to make choices. Malnutrition kind of goes along with starvation. Thyroxine, remember we talked about thyroid hormone, that really drives our basal metabolic rate. Too little, it really slows down. Too much, it goes into overdrive. And elevation. They think one of the reasons that people in Denver is the city with the least obesity in the nation, is because of the high elevation. It's one theory. So here I just want to show this image because I want you to think again about not everything being just calories going into a system or calories going out to a system. When there are refined carbohydrates taken in, so remember that starch gets quickly digested to the glucose. And then there's fructose, which is half of our sucrose, remember? So, or a high fructose corn syrup. So fructose coming in a high dose from a processed food. refined carbohydrates. What this does is it throws off our hormonal balance. It causes the way we decide how we're going to utilize that energy or store that energy. And then it also changes the behaviors that we have as far as our drive for eating. So when we eat those foods, it changes our hormones, it changes the behaviors, and then it causes us to eat more and then become larger. So this ends up being this vicious cycle. I'm going to talk a little more in detail about appetite and hunger and satiety. Remember, appetite is a kind of a sense of wanting food, that desire for food. And hunger is really that physiologic need for food. And let's start with that. If we see the hunger. So let's say you didn't eat anything. You have no food in the stomach. Well, ghrelin ends up being released. So that's a hormone which is going to do a couple things. One is, the stomach contractions that you have when you're really hungry. Ghrelin is going to stimulate the stomach contractions. So it's going to give you that hunger feeling. It's also going to travel to the brain and tell the hunger center, yeah, I need to eat. I need some food. So that is really going to drive you to food-seeking behavior. Now, if there's no nutrients in the bloodstream as well, so low blood sugar, then that's also going to drive you to eat. Now, hunger and appetite kind of overlay each other. They overlap. So you could be hungry and then you smell the food, and you see the food. So that will actually stimulate endorphins in your brain, and that increases the desire for food. So before you were hungry and you had a physiologic drive, now you have appetite on top of it, the desire to eat. So that again drives you to seek food. And you can see how this really helped us, prior to the abundance of food in our environment, because it helped us survive. I do want to point out that appetite works even when you're not hungry. And I'm sure you've experienced this. You have probably walked in, someone's making chocolate chip cookies, that smell is overwhelming, and you love chocolate chip cookies, but you just had a meal, but now you really, really want that cookie. And it can go with anything. Maybe it's a quesadilla or your favorite hamburger, but those smells can override the normal feelings of not being hungry. So once we're eating, there are things that actually stimulate us to continue eating even when we're not hungry. And we can think about the presence of others. Other people are eating, their social stimulation. And it could be the lighting, the music, the taste of the food. The food may taste good, or just the abundance of food. Maybe the food's not gone. Maybe your plate's, not empty. And Dr. Wansink, as we talked at the beginning of the semester, really has done a lot of research in this realm about the different lighting and music and how people respond to that and eat more or less, whether or not they're hungry. But there is an awareness of satiety, and that's satiety means being full, and there are a few things that do that. One is just the food is going to trigger the the stretch receptors in the stomach. So, that feeling when you've eaten too much, that the stomach stretches out, well, that actually sends a signal to the brain that says, yeah, I'm full. We have food in the stomach now. You can, turn off all these other cues. So it goes to the satiety center. When nutrients actually enter the intestines, so they go from, they got to go down the esophagus, in the stomach, down to the intestines, and then they're released, that also signals hormones that go to the brain and say, hey, we're full. We actually do have food in the intestines. We're good. And then lastly, when, before we started with no nutrients in the bloodstream, now there are nutrients in the bloodstream, and that will signal insulin. And remember, insulin is basically our storage hormone, but it's basically saying, okay, insulin, there's food in the bloodstream. Insulin takes those nutrients and stores them. It also signals the brain that there are nutrients in the brain. So we're going to finish up with a couple things here on feasting and fasting. So when you eat too much, overeat, you have carbohydrates, which breaks down to glucose. Remember, it first gets stored in the liver and the muscle as glycogen. But if you continue eating, it's going to be stored as fat. Next is fat. If you eat too much fat, it's going to break down into a fatty acid. Those fatty acids just get stored as fat. And lastly is protein. When protein is broken down into amino acids, and then that is broken, that ends up, remember, we don't want to use this for energy, but we also really don't want to break it down and store it. So if we have amino acids, generally they're going to be utilized for all of those functions that we talked about, from our structures, making our skin, our bones, our muscles, the ligaments, antibodies, function with our immune system, thinking about our acid-base balance and buffering, all those important functions of proteins. But if you have too much, it's going to be, we're going to lose this nitrogen here, it's going to be lost in the urine, and then it's going to get stored as fat. Okay, now what about if you don't eat? If you go through a fasting phase. So generally the initial fasting phase, if you don't have any food in the blood, nutrients in the blood because you haven't eaten, they'll start by taking the glucose out of the liver. So the liver supplies the bloodstream with glucose, the muscle can supply itself. And so that gives energy. The fat stores, we pull the fat, we all have plenty of fat stores, we pull that fat out and we use that as energy. Now if you continue fasting, you end up breaking down your proteins. End up taking those amino acids, you end up losing that nitrogen, you make ketone bodies, you make glucose, and that gives energy. You continue to use those fat stores as well. So the ketone bodies, generally they say it takes about 10 days to really get these to help supply the body with energy. And lastly, I just want to emphasize that obesity is now a global epidemic. It's not just a problem in the developed world. There are as many obese individuals as there are malnourished individuals. And this is a quote that I've heard: we have not had a global collapse of willpower in the last 30 years. So we're the same. It's our food and our surroundings that really have changed. And so I don't want you to leave this class with the thought that people are just, they're lazy, they're slothful, and they don't have any willpower. Because, we're pretty much all built the same. And we have been for a long time. It's the environment around us that has changed. So the causes that contribute to obesity: genetics, hormones, environment, types of food, metabolism, socioeconomic status. Notice I don't have willpower on here. Okay, so I really want you to leave this class knowing that there are many contributing factors to the development of obesity.